He didn't remember falling asleep. One moment he'd been crouched beneath the Aston Martin with a flashlight clenched between his teeth, tracing the edges of a wiring harness that had no business existing in a car from 1963. The next, gray Pennsylvania light was bleeding through the gap under the garage door, and his left arm had gone completely numb from the elbow down. He sat up slowly, shaking out his hand, and looked at the car. It looked back at him the way things do when they know something you don't. The Aston Martin sat low and still in the center of the garage, its dark green paint catching the early light in a way that made it look almost alive. Most of the chrome had gone dull with age. The leather inside was cracked and peeling at the seams. The rear quarter panel had a long dent running from wheel arch to trunk, the kind of damage that came from something heavy and slow rather than a collision, like someone had pushed it into a wall or let a wall come to it and simply left it there. But Cole had spent enough time under this car now to know what he'd found beneath all that neglect. He picked up the flashlight from where it had rolled against the drain tray and clicked it on, though he didn't need it for what he was thinking. He just needed something to hold. 3 nights. He'd had the car 3 nights, and in that time, he had not slept more than 4 hours total. Not because he was chasing anything in particular. He'd started simple, draining the old fuel, checking compression, looking for why the engine refused to turn over. And then he'd found the first thing that didn't fit, and then the second, and then he'd stopped looking at the car the way you look at a broken machine and started looking at it the way you look at a message written in a language you're only beginning to understand. The wiring harness was the first thing. Factory Aston Martin wiring from that era was a known disaster. Lucas Electrics, nicknamed the Prince of Darkness by everyone who'd ever had to work on British cars of the period, because the damn things failed constantly and unpredictably. But this harness was something else entirely. The routing was different. The gauge was heavier than spec, and in 2 places there were connectors that Cole had never seen on any car from that decade. Small, precision-machined junction blocks that looked almost aerospace in origin. He'd photographed everything. 12 rolls of photos on the digital camera he used for insurance documentation. The cheap one he kept on a shelf above the workbench. The second thing was the engine block itself. Cole had pulled the valve covers the previous afternoon after Sophie had gone to school and the house was quiet. He'd expected the worst. Seized rings, cracked seats, the kind of internal damage you saw when an engine had sat for years with moisture in the cylinders. What he found instead was a block that had been machined to tolerances he had to check twice with his micrometer because he didn't trust the first reading. Tighter than production spec. Significantly tighter. The kind of precision that didn't come from a factory floor in the early 60s. It came from an engineer working alone, taking time, caring about something that the production line would never care about. He'd sat with that for a long time before he pulled the engine number. The number was there, stamped correctly, in the right location, with the right font. But when he cross-referenced it against his database, a subscription service he used for sourcing parts on vintage British iron, it came back unregistered. Not stolen, not flagged, simply absent. As if the number existed in a private registry that his database didn't have access to. That was when he'd found the documents. They were behind the dashboard, tucked into a gap between the instrument cluster and the firewall, inside a leather folder that had been wrapped in oilcloth and then wrapped again in what appeared to be aircraft-grade heat shielding. Whoever had put them there had been serious about preservation. The folder was dry. The documents inside were yellowed and fragile at the edges, but intact. Cole had spent the rest of that night reading them. Most of it was technical. Hand-drawn schematics, dimensioned in pencil, with margin notes in cramped English handwriting that moved fast and assumed the reader already knew most of what was being described. Cole understood maybe 60% of it, enough to know that what he was looking at was not a standard production vehicle. Enough to know that someone, sometime in the early 1960s, had built this car to a specification that went well beyond anything Aston Martin had officially put into production. And tucked at the back of the folder, between 2 sheets of technical drawings, was a single letter. Cole hadn't read the letter yet. He'd gotten as far as the salutation, the name at the top. And then his phone had rung with Sophie's school calling about a permission slip. And by the time he'd handled that, it was past midnight, and he'd sat back down on the floor and apparently fallen asleep. He looked at the car now in the gray morning light and thought about the name on that letter. Then he heard the side door of the house open and Sophie's footsteps on the path between the house and the garage. She knocked twice, which was their rule. She always knocked before coming in, because Cole had made that rule when she was 5, and he'd been worried about her walking into an engine lift or a pressurized line. She'd kept the habit even though she was 8 now and old enough to understand most of the hazards. "Dad, are you in there?" "Yeah, Bug. Come in." The door swung open and Sophie appeared in her school clothes, jeans and the blue sweater with the small horse embroidered on the chest that her grandmother had sent 2 birthdays ago and that Sophie still wore even though it was starting to get snug across the shoulders. She was carrying a piece of toast with peanut butter, and she'd clearly brushed her hair herself because it was mostly correct, but there was a section near the back that had gone sideways. She looked at him on the floor and then at the car and then back at him. "Did you sleep in here again?" "Little bit." "Dad?" "I know." She came in and handed him the toast without being asked, which was a Sophie thing. She always did that, offered food before she'd had any herself, and it was a habit he recognized with an ache because it was her mother's habit exactly. He took a bite and handed it back. "You should eat breakfast," she said. "You should eat that. You've got school in—" He checked his watch and winced. 40 minutes. "I know. I made my lunch already." She was looking at the car again with that particular look she got sometimes, the one that was more curious than cautious. "Did you figure out what's wrong with it?" Cole looked at the Aston Martin. He thought about the wiring harness and the engine tolerances and the hidden documents and the letter he hadn't finished reading. "I figured out a few things," he said. "But mostly I figured out I don't know as much as I thought I did." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Is that bad?" "Not always. Sometimes it means you found something interesting." She looked at him for a moment, then back at the car, then she handed him the rest of the toast and said, "Okay, I'm going to finish getting ready," and turned and walked back to the house. Cole listened to the side door close and sat there on the floor of his garage with a half-eaten piece of toast, looking at the car that someone had hidden a secret inside like a message in a bottle. And he thought about what interesting might cost him before this was over. He dropped Sophie at school at 7:45 and was back in the garage by 8:15. He ate a proper breakfast this time, cereal, coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting down felt like too much of a commitment. Then he went back to the car and opened the leather folder and picked up the letter from where he'd left it, and this time he read it all the way through. It took him 3 readings to fully absorb what it said. The letter was dated July 1963. It was written in the same cramped, fast handwriting as the margin notes on the schematics. The author identified himself only by initials, R.H.L., and the letter was addressed to someone named David Ashworth, described in the letter as the only man I trust to understand what this vehicle represents and why it cannot be registered. Cole read the key passage 3 times, his coffee going cold beside him. This car was never meant to exist on paper. She was built to answer a question that the company had already decided not to ask publicly, whether the architecture of the DB could support a fully bespoke competition specification without compromising the character of the road car. The answer is yes, though at considerable cost of time and sanity. I am writing this because I will not be with the program when she is eventually discovered, and I want whoever finds her to understand that she is not a factory error or an unauthorized modification. She is the car we should have built. Keep her hidden until the world is ready to appreciate what she is. There was more: practical information about the car's specific modifications, details about the engine specification, a reference to records kept in a separate location that RHL described as the brown envelope at the Newport Street address. But Cole had stopped absorbing the technical details. He was thinking about the phrase "whoever finds her." Whoever finds her. Past tense and future tense at the same time, written by a man who had known 60 years ago that someone would eventually be sitting exactly where Cole was sitting now, reading exactly these words. He set the letter down carefully on the clean section of workbench he'd been reserving for the documents and stood up and walked to the back of the garage and stood there looking at nothing for a while. Then he picked up his phone and opened his browser and typed, Aston Martin DB5, prototype 1963, lost experimental. The results were not helpful in a practical sense, but they were interesting in a confirming your suspicions sense. There was a small ecosystem of automotive historians and collectors who tracked rumors about Aston Martin's experimental programs from the early 60s. Several forum threads mentioned an unverified story about a bespoke prototype that had been built outside the normal production records, sometimes called the Ghost DB in collector circles, a nickname that appeared to have originated with a British motoring journalist in the late 80s. Nobody had ever substantiated it. Most serious historians dismissed it. Cole looked at the letter on his workbench. He thought about the engine tolerances, the wiring harness, the precision machined connectors that had no business being in a 1963 automobile. He picked up his phone and called Mike Dorsey. Mike was 61 years old and had spent 35 years as a restoration specialist for a museum in Philadelphia that nobody had ever heard of, but that possessed, quietly and without advertising the fact, one of the better collections of pre-war European automobiles on the East Coast. Cole had met him 6 years ago when a client had brought in a Jaguar XK120 with a provenance dispute, and Mike had driven down from Philadelphia on a Saturday morning to look at it because he was curious and because Cole had asked nicely. They'd been something like friends since then, in the way that people who speak the same professional language become friends without quite meaning to. Mike picked up on the third ring. Cole, it's Tuesday. Yeah. I have a Tuesday thing. I know, this is quick. Cole paused, deciding how to say it. I need to ask you something about pre-production Aston Martin documentation from the early 60s. There was a silence on the other end that told Cole that Mike understood this was not a casual question. What kind of something? Mike said. I need to know if you know anyone who would recognize a hand-built prototype from that era. Engine modifications, wiring modifications. Custom specification, non-registered chassis. Another silence, longer this time. Cole, Mike said carefully, are you calling me to tell me you've got a Ghost DB in your garage in Mill Haven? Cole was quiet for a moment. Where'd you hear that name? Every serious collector of British iron has heard that name. It's like Bigfoot for car people. Mike's voice had changed. The Tuesday thing irritation was completely gone. Most people think it's a legend. Are you telling me it's not a legend? I'm telling you I have something in my garage that I can't explain with the reference material I have access to. And I found documentation inside the vehicle that I need someone qualified to look at. What kind of documentation? A letter, technical drawings, dated 1963. Mike said something under his breath that Cole couldn't quite hear, but sounded approximately like Holy Mother of, before catching himself. Okay. I'm calling you back in 5 minutes. He hung up. Cole set his phone on the workbench and stood looking at the Aston Martin. He was aware that he was in some kind of transition, that the morning before this one had been the last morning of a version of his life, and that whatever came next was going to be different in ways he couldn't fully see yet. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. It was the feeling of standing at the top of a very long staircase in the dark, knowing the stairs were there, not knowing how many there were, or what was at the bottom. His phone rang. Okay, Mike said when Cole picked up. I cleared my Tuesday thing. I'm coming down tomorrow morning. First, do not let anyone into that garage. Do not tell anyone what you have. Do not put anything online. Do not take any more photographs than you already have. I've already taken photographs. Keep them encrypted and off any cloud service. Do you have someone you trust to look at authentication of vintage documents, paper, ink, that kind of thing? Not personally. I do. I'll bring her. Victoria Sinclair. You know that name? Cole didn't. Should I? She's a collector. Serious collector. Also happens to have a background in materials science, and she's done authentication work for Sotheby's and Christie's on 3 separate major automotive sales in the last 5 years. She's the person you want looking at those documents. Mike paused. She's also, he seemed to be searching for the right word, intense. Just giving you fair warning. Okay. She knows things about these cars that I don't know, and I know a lot. If your documentation is what you think it is, she'll know it faster than I will. Another pause. And Cole, if this is real, you understand what you're sitting on. Cole looked at the Aston Martin. He thought about the $14,000 he'd spent at Marcus Webb's dealership. He thought about the $2,000 left in his checking account and the rent that was due in 3 weeks and the cost of Sophie's dental appointment he'd been putting off. "I'm starting to," he said. "Don't move anything. Don't start the engine. Don't let anyone in. I'll be there by 9 tomorrow morning." Mike hung up. Cole stood in his garage alone with the car and the letter and the weight of what the day had just become, and he realized that his hands were very slightly unsteady. He made himself a second cup of coffee. Then he went back to work. They arrived at 8:57 the next morning, which told Cole something about Mike Dorsey that he already knew. The man was constitutionally incapable of being late. Cole heard the car before he saw it, a clean-running diesel SUV pulling into the driveway with that particular note of a well-maintained engine that mechanics register the way musicians register tuning. He came out of the garage wiping his hands on a shop rag and watched Mike Dorsey climb out of the driver's side, shorter than Cole remembered, but moving with the same compact, purposeful energy he always had. The passenger door opened and Victoria Sinclair stepped out. Cole's first impression was that Mike hadn't been wrong about intents. She was maybe 30, dressed in clothes that were practical rather than expensive-looking, though Cole suspected the distinction was deceptive. Dark jeans, a fitted jacket the color of slate, hair pulled back without ceremony. She was looking at the garage with a focused, assessing attention that reminded Cole of the way certain customers looked at an engine, not admiring it, not fearing it, just measuring it against some internal standard. She wasn't looking at Cole at all. She was looking at the building behind him. "Victoria," Mike said. "This is Cole Maddox. Cole?" "Victoria Sinclair." She looked at Cole then. Her eyes were dark and direct, and she had the expression of someone who has driven a long way for something that had better be worth it. "Mike told me what you said on the phone," she said, without preamble. "Before we go inside, how did you come to have this vehicle?" Cole told her. He kept it factual. The breakdown, Sophie's performance, the dealership, Marcus Webb, and his contemptuous pitch about how the Aston Martin wasn't worth Cole's time. He told it without editorializing, which took some effort, but he'd found over the years that editorializing put people's defenses up, and he needed these two people to trust what he was showing them. Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He sold it to you as a non-runner with no provenance." "Yes." "For $14,000. "Yes." She glanced at Mike, then back at Cole. "And he knew what he had?" "I don't know what he knew. I know he told me it wasn't worth my time, and I know I don't believe him." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the predecessor to one. "Okay," she said. "Show me the car." They went inside. Cole had spent the previous afternoon clearing the garage to the degree that was possible, organizing the tools, moving the parts he'd removed from the Aston Martin to the designated shelving along the back wall, laying out the documentation on the clean section of workbench under a bright LED work light he'd borrowed from his neighbor. He was aware that the space was still unmistakably a working garage rather than anything more professional, and for a moment he felt the gap between what he had and what these two people were accustomed to dealing with. But then Victoria walked to the car and crouched beside the passenger side door and ran her fingers along the door jamb, and Cole watched her face, and the gap stopped mattering. She saw it immediately. Whatever it was she was looking for, she found it within 60 seconds of being in the room. She stood up. "Mike, come here." Mike crossed to her, and she pointed, and Mike looked, and Cole watched both of their faces perform the same sequence. Disbelief, recognition, controlled effort not to react. "Cole," Mike said, without turning around, "when you pulled the engine number, what service did you use for the cross-reference?" Cole told him. "Okay, their database for pre-production Aston Martin is incomplete. Has been for years." Mike finally turned around. "Can we see the documents?" Cole walked them to the workbench. Victoria put on a pair of thin cotton gloves she'd produced from her jacket pocket, which suggested she'd come prepared for exactly this possibility, and picked up the letter. She read it. Cole watched her face while she read it, and it was not a face that gave things away easily, but he saw the moment she hit the key passage, because she went very still. The kind of still that people go when they're working hard to keep their reaction on the inside. She set the letter down gently and looked at the schematics, one at a time, touching only the edges. Then she looked at Cole. How much of this have you read? All of it that I can understand. The technical drawings, about 60%. What's your background? How do you know what you're looking at? I've been doing restorations for 11 years. I specialize in European post-war, mostly British. I've worked on 12 Aston Martins, 3 of them pre-DB6. He paused. I know what a standard DB5 engine looks like. The tolerances on the block in this car are not standard. She was quiet, looking at him. It was the kind of look that was taking inventory. Have you told anyone else about this? Mike. That's it. No forums, no social media, no calls to... No. What about the dealership, Webb? Have you had any contact with him since the purchase? No. Cole hesitated. Should I expect to? Victoria and Mike exchanged a look. It was a brief look, the kind of exchange between people who'd had enough professional history that they could communicate in shorthand. Potentially, Victoria said, without elaborating. She turned back to the car. I want to look at the engine. Cole showed her everything he'd found. He talked through the wiring harness first, walking her along the routing points, showing her the anomalous connectors. She listened without saying much, but she asked 2 questions that told him she already understood the significance. Not questions about what he was seeing, but questions about dating. How he'd established when the connectors had been installed, whether there was any evidence of later modification. He showed her his photographs. She went through them methodically on his camera, zooming in on the details, occasionally turning the camera to Mike with a particular image highlighted. Then Cole opened the hood and she leaned in and looked at the engine for a long time without touching anything. I need a micrometer, she said finally. Do you have one? He handed her his. She measured 2 of the cylinder bore surfaces, reaching past the head to access them, which required patience and a particular angle of the wrist, and checked the reading and straightened up. Okay, she said. She sounded like someone who has just confirmed something they were already fairly certain of, and who is still surprised anyway. Okay, what? Cole said. She looked at him. The assessing quality in her expression had shifted into something more straightforward. The documents are real, she said. I can't give you a formal authentication without laboratory analysis of the paper and ink, but I've looked at enough period Aston Martin documentation to recognize the handwriting style and the technical nomenclature, and the schematics are consistent with drawings produced by the experimental engineering group in that period. The modifications described in the documents match what's in this car. She paused. The RHL in the letter. I think it's Reginald Lofthouse. He was a senior engineer in the Advanced Projects Division from 1959 to 1965. He died in 1971 without ever publicly discussing his work on the prototypes. Cole was quiet for a moment. So this is real? I believe so. With appropriate verification, yes. She picked up the letter again, holding it gently by the edge. The letter mentions records at a Newport Street address. I have access to a private archive in London that may contain those records. I can make calls today. Why would you do that? The question came out more directly than Cole had intended. Victoria looked at him without seeming offended. Because this matters, she said, to the historical record, to the people who care about what this period of automotive engineering represents. A pause. And because if this vehicle is authenticated, its value is going to be significant, and you're going to need expert support to protect that value and your ownership claim. Mike tells me you're the legal owner. I have the bill of sale. Good. Keep it somewhere very secure. Her voice had shifted slightly, still direct, but with an undertone of something that was either caution or concern. Cole couldn't tell which. The man who sold this to you, when he figures out what he had, he may not take it quietly. Cole thought about Marcus Webb. The particular quality of his contempt at the dealership, the way he'd moved through his own showroom like a man who had never been wrong about anything. The way he'd talked about the Aston Martin, not dismissively, Cole realized now, but with the careful dismissiveness of someone performing indifference. He already knows, Cole said. Victoria and Mike both looked at him. He knew I was a mechanic when I came in. He watched me look at the car. He sold it to me for $14,000, and he told me it wasn't worth my time. Cole thought about the whole transaction, replaying it. He was too casual about it, like he wanted me to take it, and he wanted to be able to say later that I was warned. He looked at the Aston Martin. He either thought I wouldn't figure it out, or he wanted me to take it somewhere he couldn't be connected to while he figured out his next move. The garage was quiet for a moment. "That's a concerning read," Mike said. "Tell me I'm wrong." Mike didn't say anything. Victoria was looking at Cole with an expression that had moved past inventory into something more like consideration. She set the letter back down on the workbench. "I'm going to make some calls," she said. "I'll need a couple of hours. Is there somewhere—" "Kitchen," Cole said. "I'll make coffee." She nodded. Then she looked at the car one more time, and what crossed her face was not excitement exactly. It was something quieter than that, something that looked like the satisfaction of a long question beginning to find its answer. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said, not quite to Cole, not quite to herself, just to the fact of the car being in the room. Then she turned and walked toward the house. Mike waited until she was through the side door. "For what it's worth," he said, keeping his voice low, "she doesn't say things like that. That's not a thing she says." Cole looked at the Aston Martin. "I know," he said, though he didn't know, not really. He was only just beginning to understand what he had. Sophie came home at 3:15 to find a woman she'd never met, sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop and a phone and 3 different notebooks, talking in a low, rapid voice to someone in what sounded like British accented English. Cole was in the garage and Mike was standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee, half listening and half watching the window. Sophie stopped in the doorway and looked at Victoria. Victoria looked back. She'd finished her sentence, something about the Newport Street estate records, and told the person on the phone she'd call them back, and set the phone down, and looked at Sophie with the same direct attention she gave everything. "You must be Sophie," she said. Sophie looked at Cole's friend who was standing by the window, who held up his coffee mug in a sort of greeting. Then she looked back at the woman at the table. "Who are you?" Sophie said. Not rude, just Sophie's particular brand of directness, which Cole had never managed to either encourage or discourage successfully because he recognized it as a trait she'd gotten from him. "My name is Victoria. I'm here to look at the car your dad's been working on." "The green one?" "That's right." Sophie considered this. "He thinks there's something special about it." "I think he's right about that." Sophie considered this too, with the seriousness she brought to assessment. Then she set her backpack down on the chair nearest the door, not the chair at the table, not committing to the room, and said, "He didn't sleep again last night." Victoria glanced toward the garage. "I know. He's very focused. He gets like that when something's important." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Is it important? The car?" Victoria looked at her for a beat. "I think so," she said. "I think it might be very important, but your dad's the one who found it." Sophie processed this. She had the quality that some children have of doing their actual thinking visibly, like watching gears. Not in a slow way, just in a way that didn't bother with the performance of casual. Then she picked up her backpack and said, "Okay," and went upstairs. Mike waited until her footsteps reached the landing. "Sharp kid." "Yeah." Victoria was looking at the ceiling where Sophie's footsteps moved across it. Her expression had gone somewhere private for a moment. Then she picked her phone back up. "I got through to the estate archive in London. There's a corresponding file on the Lofthouse experimental program. They're pulling it tonight and sending photographs tomorrow morning. And that, it establishes a chain of documentation that connects what's in Cole's garage to a specific program within Aston Martin's Advanced Engineering Division in 1962 and 63. If those documents corroborate what's in the letter and the schematics," she paused, "then we're looking at a vehicle that doesn't just have significant monetary value. We're looking at something that automotive historians have been arguing about for 30 years. Mike nodded slowly. "You're going to want to get ahead of the ownership question before word gets out." "Yes." Her expression sharpened, "which is why I'm also calling my attorney this afternoon. If Webb decides to make a claim, does he have grounds?" "Technically, almost certainly not. He accepted payment and transferred the vehicle. The bill of sale is legal. She looked toward the garage window. But legal and expensive are different things, and people like Marcus Webb understand that clearly. Mike followed her gaze toward the garage. Through the window, they could just see Cole's feet beneath the car, prone on the creeper, working. "He won't back down easy," Mike said. It was a statement, not a question. "No," Victoria agreed. She picked up her phone. "Neither will I." Bim. Cole came in from the garage at 7, hands scrubbed but still carrying the particular deep knuckle stain that shop work leaves behind even after washing. The kitchen smelled like the pasta Sophie had made, because Sophie had gone through a phase 2 months ago of deciding that cooking was interesting and had not yet come out the other side of it. She made pasta approximately 4 times a week, with varying degrees of success. This one was good. Cole could tell by the way the kitchen smelled when he came through the door. Mike had gone back to Philadelphia at 5, promising to return in 2 days with 2 colleagues from the museum's authentication department. Victoria was still at the table, but the 3 notebooks and the laptop were closed and stacked to one side, and she was sitting with a cup of tea. Sophie had made her tea at some point, apparently, without Cole knowing, which was a Sophie move, looking at her phone with the particular quality of someone who is done for the day. Sophie was at the stove, stirring something. "That smells good, Bug," Cole said. "I put extra garlic," Sophie said with satisfaction. "She insisted," Victoria said, looking up from her phone. There was something slightly different in her voice. Not softer exactly, but less clipped. The day had worn off something. "Extra garlic is always correct," Cole said. "I told her that," Sophie said. Cole looked at Victoria and raised his eyebrows slightly. A question. "She's right," Victoria said. He washed his hands again at the kitchen sink and then stood at the counter and ate a bowl of pasta standing up because sitting down still felt like a commitment he wasn't quite ready to make. Sophie talked about school, something about a science project involving plant growth. And Victoria listened with the attentive quality Cole was already starting to recognize as characteristic of her, the quality of someone who considers being addressed by another person as something that warrants actual attention. After dinner, Sophie did her homework at the kitchen table while Cole walked Victoria to Mike's SUV. She was driving it back, leaving her own car at Mike's place and returning tomorrow. They stood in the driveway in the cool evening air. The garage door was closed, but Cole could feel the car in there the way you can feel a thing that has changed the weight of your day. "I should have preliminary photographs from the London archive by 8 tomorrow morning," Victoria said. "If they show what I think they'll show, we'll need to move fairly quickly on the formal authentication process." "How long does that take?" "Weeks, potentially. Months for full certification. But we can establish enough verifiable provenance in the first 10 days to make a legal challenge extremely difficult to sustain." She looked at him. "I want to be clear about something. I'm helping because this car matters to the historical record, to collectors, to people who care about this period of engineering. That's real. But you're the owner. Every decision is yours." Cole nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Not challenging him exactly, just checking. "It's my garage," Cole said. "My name on the bill of sale, my $14,000. He paused. "And my daughter, who made you tea." Something crossed Victoria's face at that. Quick, unguarded, gone before he could fully read it. "She didn't have to do that." "No," Cole said. "She wanted to." Victoria looked at the garage door for a moment, and Cole had the sense of something being considered and then set aside for later. "I'll be here at 8, she said. She got in the SUV and backed out of the driveway. Cole stood and watched the taillights disappear down the street. Then he went back inside, where Sophie was still at the kitchen table with her homework, pencil moving, head bent, wholly absorbed in something about photosynthesis that was going to require a diagram, she'd told him, and probably a poster. And did he have any green markers? Cole sat down across from her and said he'd check in the drawer by the refrigerator. He found 2 green markers. One worked and one didn't, which was the natural state of all marker collections. He set the working one on the table beside Sophie's notebook. "Dad?" she said, without looking up. "Yeah." "Is the car lady coming back tomorrow?" "Yeah, Bug, she is." Sophie nodded, still writing. "I like her," she said, with the simple, uncomplicated certainty of 8 years old. Cole sat with that for a moment. Through the window, the driveway was empty and dark, and the night had settled in around the house. In the garage, the car sat waiting, patient as it had been for 60 years, still holding whatever it was trying to say. "Yeah," Cole said. "I think I might too." Sophie turned the page and started on her diagram. The photographs from London arrived at 7:53 in the morning. Cole was already in the garage when Victoria knocked on the side door, laptop under her arm, a coffee she'd picked up somewhere in her other hand. He'd been up since 5:30, not working exactly, just in the garage the way some people go to a particular room when they need to think. Sophie was still asleep. The house was quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator running and a bird somewhere outside doing something repetitive and unmusical. "They came early," Victoria said, by way of greeting. She didn't wait to be invited in. She crossed to the workbench, set down the coffee, which Cole noticed she hadn't offered him, which meant she'd gotten it for herself and wasn't performing hospitality, which he respected, and opened the laptop. Cole came to stand beside her. The photographs were good. Whoever had pulled this archive file in London had done it carefully, scanning each document flat with even lighting, no shadows across the text. The file names were dated and numbered. Victoria had them arranged in a folder, and she opened them in sequence, not fast, moving through each one with the focused quiet of someone reading a language they know well. Cole watched the documents appear on the screen one at a time. Technical specifications, internal memos on headed paper, 2 hand-drawn diagrams that were clearly in the same style as the schematics in Cole's leather folder. Same pencil weight, same cramped notation in the margins, same way of indicating tolerances with a particular bracket notation he'd seen 3 times now and would recognize anywhere. And then a personnel record. Reginald Henry Lofthouse, Senior Engineer, Advanced Projects. The initials matched. "There," Victoria said quietly. Cole didn't say anything. He was looking at the photograph of a man who had been dead for more than 50 years, and who had apparently spent a significant portion of his professional life building a car in secret, hiding the documentation inside it, and writing a letter to someone named David Ashworth about the world being ready to understand what the car was. Cole thought about that, until the world is ready, and thought about the 60 years the car had spent in progressively worse states of neglect, and thought about Marcus Webb's contemptuous pitch in a dealership that smelled like air freshener and money. Ready was a complicated concept. The specifications in this file, Victoria said, pulling up a particular document, describe the same engine modifications you found in the car. The bore tolerances, the modified camshaft profile, the altered compression ratio. She pointed at a line of text. This is a development note from August 1962. The program was called Project Meridian internally. It was closed in October 1963, officially because of budget reallocation. She paused. Unofficially, based on what Lofthouse wrote in your letter, because the company decided not to pursue a bespoke competition specification and wanted to focus on the production DB5. And the car? The car was supposed to be destroyed. Standard procedure for discontinued experimental programs at the time. You don't leave prototypes sitting around where they raise questions. She looked at the personnel record again. Lofthouse clearly didn't destroy it. He hid it instead. Cole considered the car behind him. Where's it been for 60 years? That, Victoria said, is a question I don't have an answer to yet. But the chain of documentation from the London archive establishes its origin. Combined with what's in the leather folder, the letter, the technical drawings, and the physical evidence in the car itself, we have a provenance case that I think is very strong. How strong? She looked at him. Strong enough to take to auction. Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about the number. The number Mike had referenced on the phone. The phrase significant value that he'd understood intellectually but hadn't fully processed in practical terms. What kind of number are we talking about? He said. Not quite a question, more like a thing he needed to say out loud in order to make space for the answer. Victoria turned back to the laptop. The last authenticated one-of-one prototype from this period with full documentation sold at a private auction in Geneva 18 months ago for $7.2 million. That was a Ferrari, which carries more name recognition in the general collector market. She paused. This is rarer than that car. Cole sat down on his shop stool, which was the only seat in the garage. He sat on it the way you sit on something when your legs decide to stop being fully cooperative. "Okay," he said. "The restoration matters," Victoria said. "A documented prototype that runs and drives will command significantly more than one in static condition. The bidding dynamic changes when buyers can hear it." "I know." Cole looked at the car. 14 days, he said, half to himself. Victoria looked at him. "What?" "I've been tracking what needs to happen to get it running. Engine rebuild, electrical systems, fuel delivery, brakes before it moves under its own power. 14 days if I work full days and some nights." "You can't do a proper restoration in 14 days. I'm not talking about a restoration. I'm talking about getting the engine running and the car mechanically sound. Cosmetic work is different. That takes as long as it takes." He looked at her. "But if you're right that Webb is going to come for this, I don't want to still be in the middle of a torn-down engine when he does. I want this car complete." Victoria was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "What do you need?" Cole told her. The parts problem was the first real obstacle. Most of what Cole needed for the engine rebuild was specific to the DB5 platform, and while that wasn't impossible to source, it wasn't a trip to the local auto parts store either. The correct piston rings, the right valve seals, gaskets made to the original specification. These things existed, but they lived in specialty suppliers in the UK and in the inventories of a small number of serious restoration shops on the East Coast. Cole had sources, but his sources were accustomed to him ordering on a timeline of weeks, not days. Victoria made 3 phone calls. Cole didn't fully understand what she said in those phone calls because she was in the kitchen while he was working and the garage door was between them. But what arrived the following morning, a delivery van from a specialty supplier in New Jersey that Cole had been trying to establish a direct account with for 2 years, told him enough. The driver carried 4 boxes into the garage, handed Cole a manifest, and left before Cole had fully processed what he was looking at. Every item on his list, correct specification, plus 2 items he hadn't asked for, a set of cylinder head studs and a rebuilt carburetor, that were better than what he'd specified, sourced from a supplier in England that Cole knew by reputation but had never been able to access directly. He stood in the garage holding the manifest and then went to find Victoria. She was at the kitchen table with the laptop again, on a call, and she held up one finger without looking up. The universal signal for 1 minute. Cole stood in the doorway and waited. When she ended the call, she looked at him. He held up the manifest. "How much do I owe you for this?" he said. She shook her head. "Consider it an investment." "That's not how I do things." "I know." She met his eyes. "Cole, the value of getting this car authenticated and operational correctly is considerably more than the cost of the parts. I'm not doing you a favor, I'm protecting the asset." A pause. "But if it matters to you, keep a running total and we'll settle it properly when this is resolved." It mattered to him. He said so. She nodded and they left it there. He went back to the garage and got to work. The days developed a rhythm. Cole worked on the car from early morning until Sophie needed to be picked up, ate dinner, put Sophie to bed, and went back to the garage. He was running on less sleep than was wise, which he was aware of and couldn't fully fix, because the alternative was slower, and slower meant more exposure, and more exposure meant more time for Marcus Webb to figure out what he'd sold. Victoria came every morning. She'd set up at the kitchen table and work from there. Phone calls, emails, coordination with the authentication specialist Mike was bringing in, correspondence with the London Archive about additional documentation. She and Cole developed a functional rhythm without discussing it. She stayed out of the garage unless he asked her something. He stayed out of the kitchen unless he needed coffee or food. Sophie had started treating her presence with the comfortable indifference of someone who has decided a person is acceptable, which in Sophie's case meant she occasionally talked to Victoria unprompted, which Cole understood as a significant endorsement. On the 4th day, while Cole was finishing the valve work on the cylinder head, Victoria appeared in the garage doorway. "I just got off the phone with Webb's attorney," she said. Cole set down his tool. "Already?" "He's claiming the sale was made in error. His position is that the vehicle was listed incorrectly and that he wasn't aware of its actual value at the time of sale." She leaned against the doorframe. It's a weak argument. The bill of sale is straightforward, and he accepted payment, but he's apparently decided to make it formally. What does that mean practically? It means he's going to try to create enough legal uncertainty to complicate any public sale or authentication process. If he can get an injunction while the case is pending, she stopped. He's counting on the cost of litigation being a deterrent. Cole looked at his hands. They were clean at the moment because he'd been working with solvents, which required gloves, but the deep stain was still there under his nails from the days before. Is it? He said. A deterrent. For you, on your own? Potentially. She said it without apology, because it was just true. Not with my attorneys on it. Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about what that meant, about the particular kind of debt that doesn't come with an interest rate, the kind that comes with expectations and dependencies, and a shift in the balance of something. Victoria. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Don't make this complicated, she said. I told you. This is an asset I believe in. My attorneys are handling cases of this kind regularly. It's not a favor. It's a transaction with a delayed settlement. She held his gaze. But if it makes you feel better, you can be insufferably grateful later. Cole almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. Okay, he said. She went back to the kitchen. Cole picked up his tool and went back to work. On the 7th day, Mike arrived with 2 colleagues from the authentication department, a paper and materials specialist named Dr. Anita Reyes, who was somewhere in her 50s and spoke almost entirely in technical language and didn't seem to notice or care, and a younger man named Patrick, who was apparently Dr. Reyes's graduate student and had the expression of someone who had been told to be calm but was having a difficult time of it. Dr. Reyes spent 4 hours with the documents. She had equipment with her, a portable spectrometer, a UV light, a reference kit for period-accurate ink and paper composition. She worked in a focused, methodical silence that filled the kitchen with an almost church-like quality. Patrick handed her things when she asked and wrote down readings and otherwise tried to be invisible. Victoria sat at the other end of the table and didn't crowd the process. Cole checked in once, around noon, and then went back to the garage because standing in the kitchen while someone examined documents was not a thing he could do productively. At 4 in the afternoon, Dr. Reyes came to the garage door. "Mr. Maddox," she said. Cole slid out from under the car on the creeper and looked up at her. "The documents are authentic," she said, without preamble. Paper composition is consistent with English manufacture from the late 1950s to mid-1960s. Ink chemistry is consistent with carbon-based black ink of the period. I found no evidence of later addition or alteration to any of the handwritten elements. She paused. The schematics were produced by the same hand as the letter. The handwriting is consistent with what I have in my reference file for Reginald Lofthouse, based on 2 authenticated samples from the Aston Martin Historical Trust Archive. Cole sat up on the creeper. He felt the weight of what she'd just said. "Thank you," he said. "Doctor." Reyes nodded as if he'd thanked her for telling him the time and went back inside. Cole sat on the garage floor for a minute, looking at the Aston Martin. Then he got back on the creeper and went back under the car. On the 9th day, Marcus Webb showed up. Cole was in the garage and didn't see him arrive. Sophie was at school. Victoria was in the kitchen. The first Cole knew about it was Victoria appearing at the garage door with her phone already in her hand, and an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not alarmed exactly, but the particular tight focus of someone managing something that requires management. "He's outside," she said. Cole came out from under the car and wiped his hands. "Just him?" "Him and a man who is very obviously not an attorney." Cole went to the small window at the side of the garage and looked. Marcus Webb was standing at the edge of the driveway in a coat that cost more than Cole's monthly rent, looking at the house with the proprietary expression of a man who has decided something belongs to him. The man beside him was large and quiet, in the way that large, quiet men are sometimes professionally. "I'll talk to him," Cole said. "Cole, it's my house." He said it without heat, just as a statement. Victoria looked at him for a moment, then stepped aside. Cole went out through the side door and walked to the driveway. Webb saw him, and his expression shifted into the version of pleasant that isn't actually pleasant. "Cole, I've been trying to reach you. I don't have a number for you. My attorney's been in touch. With my attorney, Cole said. Yeah. Webb's pleasant expression recalibrated slightly. He glanced at the large, quiet man as if taking confirmation from him, then back at Cole. I think we can handle this without making it complicated. The car was sold in error. I'm prepared to compensate you fairly for the inconvenience. What's fairly? $25,000. Cole looked at him. He thought about what Victoria had said about the Geneva auction. $7.2 million. That was for a Ferrari, and this was rarer than that car. He thought about $14,000 out of his savings account. He thought about the letter inside the car, and the man who'd written it, and 60 years of whoever finds her. No, Cole said. Webb's expression lost another layer of pleasant. Cole, you bought a non-running vehicle as is for $14,000. You've had it 9 days. I'm offering you a significant profit on a car you've barely had time to... I've had time to read the documentation I found inside it, Cole said, and I've had time to have that documentation independently authenticated. Webb went still. It was a specific kind of still. Not surprised. Not processing. The still of a man who has been caught at something and is now deciding which version of the next move to make. I don't know what you think you found, Webb said. I think I found what you knew was in there, Cole said. And I think you sold it to me because you couldn't keep it without someone asking questions, and you thought a mechanic from Millhaven wasn't going to figure it out. He kept his voice level. He was aware of the large, quiet man and the fact that this conversation was happening on his own driveway, which was technically home territory, though that was a thin comfort. You were wrong about that. Webb looked at him for a long time. The pleasant was gone entirely now, replaced with something flatter and more honest. The vehicle belongs to me, Webb said, legally or otherwise. I'll be pursuing every available avenue to... You should talk to your attorney, Cole said. My understanding is he's been in contact with mine. He turned and walked back inside without waiting for a response. His hands were steady, which surprised him. Victoria was standing just inside the kitchen door. She'd heard. Good, she said quietly. Cole poured himself a glass of water and drank half of it and set it on the counter. Outside through the window, he could see Webb's car. German luxury, dark gray. The kind of car that was meant to signal that its owner had never been inconvenienced, reversing out of the driveway. He's not done, Cole said. No, Victoria agreed, but neither are we. On the 11th night, Sophie came down at 9:30 because she couldn't sleep, which happens sometimes, and she found Cole at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in handwriting and Victoria across from him with her laptop, both of them working in the easy silence of people who have gotten accustomed to sharing a space. Sophie stood in the doorway in her pajamas and looked at both of them. You're still here, she said to Victoria. I'm still here, Victoria agreed. Sophie considered this. Do you want tea again? I would love tea. Sophie came in and put the kettle on with the comfortable familiarity of someone who knows where everything is, which she did because it was her kitchen. Cole watched her measure out the tea without being asked what kind Victoria wanted, because Victoria always had the same kind, which Sophie had noticed and filed away. And he felt something specific and complicated move through him watching his 8-year-old daughter perform this small, attentive act. Victoria was watching Sophie too. Her expression had the quality Cole had learned to recognize as Victoria actually feeling something she hadn't planned for. Sophie set the mug in front of Victoria and climbed into the chair beside Cole and leaned against his arm with the unself-conscious weight of a child who is tired and doesn't feel like pretending otherwise. Did you make progress on the car today? Sophie asked, directed at approximately both of them. Your dad got the fuel system working, Victoria said. Sophie looked up at Cole. Really? Really? It's not running yet, but we're getting there. Sophie was quiet for a moment, leaning against him. Then she said, That man came to the house today. Cole looked at her. He'd thought she didn't know. She'd been at school. But Sophie had a way of absorbing the information in a room when she got home, reading the adults around her the way kids do when they've learned that the emotional weather matters as much as the factual report. Who told you? Cole said. Nobody. I could tell. She was looking at the table. He wants the car back, right? He thinks he does. But it's ours. Cole put his arm around her. Yeah, Bug. It's ours. Sophie sat with that for a moment. Then she looked at Victoria. Is it going to be okay? Victoria didn't give her the automatic yes that adults tend to give children when asked that question. She thought about it, which Sophie would notice, and said, I think so. Your dad found the right car and he's doing the right things with it. A pause. And he's got good people on his side. Sophie looked at her for a moment with that particular inventory quality and then apparently decided this was a satisfactory answer because she nodded and leaned back against Cole's arm. Okay, she said. They sat there, the three of them, in the kitchen light. Outside, the driveway was dark and quiet. In the garage, the Aston Martin waited out the night in its patient, accumulated silence, 3 days away from the moment when Cole would finally ask it to speak. The 12th day started badly. Cole had been under the car at 11 the previous night, finishing the brake lines, and he'd found a problem with the master cylinder that set him back 2 hours, because the component was specific enough that his original replacement didn't fit cleanly, and he had to machine an adapter by hand on the small lathe at the back of the garage. He'd finally gotten to bed at 2 in the morning and been back up at 5:30, which meant he was running on the particular thin, brittle energy of accumulated sleep deprivation. Functional on the surface, unreliable underneath. And then Victoria called at 7:15, before she'd arrived, which she didn't normally do. Webb filed for an emergency injunction yesterday afternoon, she said. My attorney got the notification this morning. The hearing is scheduled for Friday. Cole was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee he hadn't yet drunk. He looked at the calendar on the wall, the one Sophie had decorated with stickers of horses at the beginning of the year. Friday was 2 days away. What does that mean for the car? He said. If the injunction is granted, it would freeze any sale or transfer pending the outcome of his ownership claim. It wouldn't give him the car, but it would prevent you from moving forward with authentication or auction while the case is pending. Victoria paused. He's trying to run out the clock. The longer this drags, the more it costs you and the more leverage he thinks he has. Can he get it? The injunction? His argument is that the sale was predicated on a mutual misunderstanding of the vehicle's value and that enforcement would be unconscionable. It's a stretch. But judges are unpredictable on emergency motions and his attorney is competent. Another pause, shorter. My attorney is better. Victoria. I know you don't like this. She said it without impatience, which he appreciated. But this is the situation. I need you to know about it before I get there. Cole drank his coffee. It had gone slightly cold while he was on the phone. He drank it anyway. Okay, he said. Come whenever you're ready. He went back to the garage. The problem with the injunction, beyond the obvious, was what it did to his timeline. Cole had been working toward a specific target: get the engine running before any legal action could complicate the authentication process. A running engine was evidence. A running engine changed the conversation from what this car might be to what this car demonstrably is, and that distinction mattered in ways both legal and practical. He had the engine rebuilt. The cylinder head was back on, torqued to spec, the valve clearances set. The fuel system was functional. The electrical system, the unusual, non-standard Lofthouse engineered electrical system, had been traced, documented, repaired at 3 points where age had degraded the insulation, and reconnected. What he didn't have yet was the ignition timing set correctly, because the timing on this engine was not standard, and the specifications in the schematics were written in a shorthand that had taken him the better part of 2 days to decode. He'd gotten there. He was fairly confident he'd gotten there. But confidence wasn't the same as certainty, and the first time he asked this engine to fire, he wanted to be certain. When Victoria arrived at 8:30, she found him on a stool at the workbench with the schematics spread out and his notes beside them, going through the timing calculation one more time. She looked at the papers and then at him. You didn't sleep. I slept. Enough? He didn't answer, which was an answer. She put her bag down and looked at the schematic over his shoulder without being invited, which she'd stopped asking permission to do somewhere around day 6. Where are you? Timing. Lofthouse used a modified advance curve. The distributor was rebuilt to a custom spec, and the base timing is offset from standard. I've been working from the schematic, but I want to verify the calculation before I try to start it. Show me. Cole looked at her sideways. You know ignition timing? I know how to check math. She sat down on the secondary stool he'd added to the workbench sometime in the second week, the one that had materialized without either of them commenting on it, the way things do when a person has been coming to the same place long enough that the space adjusts around them. He walked her through the calculation. She asked 2 questions, precise questions, the kind that came from actually following the logic rather than performing attention, and then looked at his final number and looked at the schematic and said, "That's right." "You're sure?" "The offset ratio is consistent with the modified distributor spec in the drawing. Your number is right." She looked at the car. "So what's stopping you?" Cole looked at the Aston Martin. He thought about what it would mean if the engine didn't fire. He thought about the injunction hearing on Friday and the 2 days between now and then, and what it would look like to walk into a legal proceeding with a car that still didn't run. He also thought about the other thing, the thing he hadn't let himself think about directly yet, that this car had been silent for 60 years, that whatever Reginald Lofthouse had built in secret, in whatever corner of a factory in the early 1960s, it had never been heard. Not really. Not the way it was supposed to be heard. "Nothing," Cole said. "Let's try it." He didn't ask Victoria to leave the garage, and she didn't offer to. She stood back near the workbench, out of the way but present, and Cole was aware of her presence the way you're aware of a person sitting with you in a waiting room. Not intrusively, just there. He checked the oil level, checked the coolant, verified the battery connections. He'd installed a modern battery in a bracket that kept it hidden below the original battery tray, which was a practical compromise he'd noted in his documentation so any future restoration work would know it was there. He checked the fuel line connections at the carburetor one more time, though he'd checked them twice the night before. Then he slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cracked under him. The steering wheel was thin and hard the way old British steering wheels are, designed for a generation of drivers who expected the car to communicate through their hands rather than isolating them from it. The gauges were original. The beautiful simple instrument cluster that Aston Martin had used in the early 60s, white on black dials and brushed aluminum housings. Cole had cleaned them during the electrical work and they were all intact, the needles resting at 0. He put his hand on the ignition key, original key, which had been on a hook in the garage when he'd bought the car, one of the few things Webb hadn't bothered to remove, and looked through the windshield at the garage wall. He turned the key. The starter motor engaged. He could hear it turning the engine over. 1 revolution, 2, the compression building in the cylinders, the fuel entering the carburetor, and then on the 3rd revolution, nothing. He let it rest for 10 seconds and tried again. Same result. The engine turned but didn't catch. Cole got out and checked the carburetor choke setting, adjusted it slightly, got back in. 3rd attempt. The engine turned twice and then coughed. A single, rough, uneven sound that was not quite a fire, but was something. Was the engine recognizing the fuel and the spark and trying to respond? And then went quiet again. "Almost," Victoria said from across the garage. She wasn't trying to be encouraging. She was just accurately reporting what she'd heard, and Cole understood the difference. He waited 2 full minutes. He sat in the car and looked at the instrument cluster and thought about the ignition advance. He thought about whether his timing calculation was right or whether it was right in theory and off in practice because the distributor had worn in ways the schematic couldn't account for. He got out and made one small mechanical adjustment, manually advancing the distributor 2 degrees beyond his calculated setting, a mechanic's instinct rather than an engineering decision, the kind of thing you learn after 11 years of coaxing dead engines back to life, and got back in. 4th attempt. The engine turned once, caught on a cylinder, stumbled, caught on 2 more, stumbled again, and then suddenly and completely it was running. Not smoothly, not at first. It came up in an uneven, searching idle, the kind of idle that an engine produces when it has been still for a very long time, and the oil is cold, and the tolerances haven't settled, and everything is finding its way back to what it was built to do. The sound filled the garage immediately, not loud, not aggressive, but present in a way that made the walls feel different, that changed the quality of the air. Cole sat with his hand on the gear shift and listened. The idle smoothed over the course of maybe 30 seconds. Not perfectly. There was a slight unevenness in it, a very minor hesitation on every fourth or fifth cycle that he'd want to look at. Once the engine was warm, but it smoothed to something that was unmistakably right. The particular sound of a well-built engine settling into itself, finding the rhythm it was made for. He looked at the oil pressure gauge. The needle was rising, slowly, then holding, sitting in the correct range. He looked at the temperature gauge, beginning to move. Normal. He sat in the car and listened to the engine run for 2 full minutes without saying anything. He was aware that his hands were not quite steady on the steering wheel, which he rested them on not because he needed to hold anything, but because he needed somewhere to put them. He got out. Victoria was still by the workbench. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, the way people cross their arms when they're cold, or when they're holding themselves together around something they didn't expect to feel. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just witnessed something that exceeded what they prepared for. "That's it," Cole said. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. "That's it," Victoria agreed. Her voice was level, but only approximately. They stood in the garage with the engine running between them, the sound of it filling the space, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't anything to say that the engine wasn't already saying better. The injunction hearing happened on Friday morning in a courtroom in downtown Philadelphia, which was far enough that Cole had to ask his neighbor Janet to take Sophie to school. He wore the one suit he owned, which was dark blue and fit him well enough because he'd bought it for his wife's funeral and had not gained or lost significant weight since, which was a grim kind of fit. He drove to Philadelphia in the truck, which felt wrong in the way that driving a workhorse vehicle to a legal proceeding always feels wrong. But the alternative was asking Victoria for a ride, and he'd made a quiet decision sometime in the last 2 weeks that he was going to maintain whatever independence he could maintain without being stubborn about it in ways that cost him practically. Victoria was already at the courthouse when he arrived, standing outside with her attorney, a woman named Sandra Chu, who was somewhere in her late 40s and had the economical manner of someone who has spent decades in rooms where time is measured in billable hours. Cole had spoken to Sandra twice by phone and liked her in the way you like a tool that does exactly what it's supposed to without requiring explanation. "How are you doing?" Victoria said when he reached them. "Fine," Cole said, which was approximately true. Sandra looked at him with the focused assessment he was getting used to from people in Victoria's orbit. "The hearing is at 10. Webb's attorney is going to argue that the sale was predicated on a shared misunderstanding of material facts, specifically that neither party understood the car's true value at the time of transaction." "That's not true," Cole said. "I didn't know the car's true value either. I bought it because I thought I could fix it." "I know. That's exactly what I need you to say if Judge Merritt asks you directly." Sandra looked at her phone, then at Victoria. "They may not call him. This is a motion hearing, not a trial. But Merritt sometimes asks questions. Be direct, be brief, don't speculate." Cole nodded. They went inside. The courtroom was not like courtrooms on television. It was smaller and more administrative, with fluorescent lighting and a gallery that was nearly empty. Marcus Webb was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a man named Gerald Holt, who had the prosperous, cushioned look of someone who had been comfortable for so long that discomfort had become a kind of philosophical offense. Webb saw Cole come in and looked at him with the flat expression of a man who is committed to a particular play and is seeing it through. Cole met his eyes briefly and then looked away, not because he was intimidated, but because Webb didn't warrant more of his attention. The hearing took 40 minutes. Gerald Holt made his argument, the mutual misunderstanding claim, wrapped in legal language that was competent if not particularly original. He introduced 2 affidavits, one from a classic car dealer in New Jersey stating that a non-running Aston Martin DB5 in the described condition would typically be valued below $25,000, and one from a Webb Automotive employee stating that the vehicle had been assessed at that range prior to sale. Sandra Chu responded. She introduced the bill of sale, which was unambiguous. She introduced a summary of the authentication findings from Dr. Reyes, which established the documentation's provenance. She introduced the engine specification analysis from Mike Dorsey's colleagues, which established the vehicle's unique character. And then she introduced something Cole hadn't known she was going to introduce, a photograph, pulled from the London Archive materials, dated October 1963. It showed Marcus Webb's father, a man named Gerald Webb Sr., identified in the archive's catalog, standing beside a dark green Aston Martin in what appeared to be a private storage facility. The photograph had been among a collection of materials donated to the archive in 1991 by the Webb family estate. Sandra set it on the table. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff's claim that he was unaware of this vehicle's potential historical significance is contradicted by his own family's documented connection to the vehicle over several decades." The courtroom was quiet. Cole looked at Marcus Webb. Webb was looking at the photograph. His expression had done something Cole hadn't seen it do before. It had gone uncertain, which was worse, somehow, than the flat confidence he'd been maintaining. It was the expression of a man who had known where the bodies were and had just watched someone dig up the yard. Judge Merritt looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at Holt. "Counselor," she said, "I'm going to need your client to address this." Holt asked for a brief recess, which the judge granted. During the 15 minutes they stood in the hallway, Victoria said nothing about the photograph, and Cole waited until they were far enough from Holt and Webb before he asked, "You knew about the photograph?" "Sandra found it 2 days ago," Victoria said, "in the archive catalog. The connection to the Webb family name wasn't obvious, and it took some cross-referencing." She looked at him steadily. "I should have told you before today." "Yeah," Cole said. "You should have." A pause. "I didn't want you going into the hearing with it in your head. I wanted you to be exactly what you are, someone who bought a car in good faith and found something unexpected inside it. If you'd known about the photograph, you might have seemed rehearsed." Cole considered this. He wasn't sure he agreed with the reasoning, but he understood it, and he understood that she'd made a call that she'd believed was in his interest rather than her own. That was different from deception, even if it sat uncomfortably. "Don't do that again," he said. "I won't," she said, and she meant it, which he could tell, which was most of why he let it go. When they went back inside, Holt asked for a continuance. Judge Merritt denied it. She heard another 15 minutes of argument and then ruled from the bench. The emergency injunction was denied. She cited the unambiguous bill of sale, the absence of fraud on the buyer's part, and what she called significant questions about the plaintiff's knowledge of the vehicle's character prior to the sale. Webb's face when the ruling came down was not the face of a man who had lost a legal motion. It was the face of a man who had made a calculation that turned out to be wrong, and who was now making a different calculation. Cole watched him and felt the hair on his arms do something. This wasn't over. It was just differently shaped. They were in the parking garage outside the courthouse, and Victoria was on the phone with Sandra about the next steps, and Cole was standing by his truck thinking about Marcus Webb's face when his own phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered it. "Mr. Maddox." The voice was male, older, with a flat quality. Not hostile, but not warm. "My name isn't important right now. What I want to tell you is that Marcus Webb is not going to stop at the legal route. He's made some calls in the last 2 days that you should know about." Cole's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "Someone who worked for Webb for 11 years and doesn't anymore." A pause. "He's trying to get the authentication specialist to recuse themselves. He has relationships with 2 people at a major auction house who he thinks can damage the documentation's credibility before formal certification is complete. And he's contacted someone he believes can access your garage." Cole went very still. "My daughter is at school during the day, yes. He's not that kind of man. This is about the car. He wants to damage it enough that it can't be authenticated. Make it ambiguous." A pause. "I thought you should know." The line went dead. Cole stood in the parking garage for a moment. Then he called Janet. Janet answered on the second ring. He told her he needed a favor. Could she pick Sophie up from school today and keep her until he got home? Janet said yes, of course. Did everything sound okay? Cole said everything was fine. He just needed to handle something. He hung up and turned to find Victoria watching him. She'd ended her call. He told her what the voice had said. Her expression tightened in a specific way. Not panic, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a threat that had just moved from abstract to specific. Your garage, she said. I need to get back. Go. She was already on her phone again. I'll call Sandra, and I'm calling the security firm I use. I'll have someone at your property within the hour. You have a security firm. Cole. She said his name the way you say a name when someone is about to argue about something that doesn't have time for argument. Go. He went. He drove back to Millhaven faster than he'd driven anywhere in recent memory, the truck's engine doing things it wasn't entirely designed for on the highway straightaways, and he spent the drive not letting himself think about what he might find when he got there. He thought instead about the timing adjustment he'd made on the 12th day, the 2 degrees he'd advanced the distributor by instinct rather than calculation, and how the engine had fired on the 4th attempt and not the 3rd, and what that meant about the gap between knowing something and trusting what you know. He pulled into the driveway at 11:47. The garage door was closed, the way he'd left it. The side door to the house was locked, the way he'd left it. He went to the garage first, unlocking the side access door and going in fast and scanning the space before he let himself breathe. The car was there, untouched as far as he could see. He went around it carefully, checking every panel, every surface. Nothing had been moved. The documentation on the workbench was exactly as he'd left it. The tools were where he'd put them. He crouched and looked under the car and then stood up and pressed his hand flat against the hood for a moment, palm on the cold metal, feeling nothing and everything. He was still standing there when the security firm's car pulled up outside. A woman got out, compact, professional, with the alert manner of someone whose job is to be aware of everything in a given radius. She introduced herself as Dana. Cole walked her through the property and they agreed on the coverage for the coming days and nights. And when they'd finished the walkthrough and Dana was setting up outside, Cole went into the kitchen and sat down at the table. He sat there for 10 minutes, doing nothing. The house was quiet around him. The refrigerator ran. A car passed on the street outside. In the garage, the car waited in its dark green silence, patient as it had always been, 60 years of waiting having apparently calibrated it for this specific kind of stillness. His phone lit up. A text from Victoria. Security confirmed en route. How is the car? He texted back, fine. Everything's fine. A pause. Then, and you? He looked at the phone. He thought about the suit he was wearing and the courtroom and Marcus Webb's face when the ruling came down and the strange anonymous call in the parking garage and the drive back at 30 miles over the posted limit and his hand on the car's hood. He typed, working on it. Her response came after a moment. Just, I know. He set the phone down on the table and sat in his quiet house. And outside in the garage, the Aston Martin waited in the dark. And the engine that Reginald Lofthouse had built 60 years ago to answer a question the world wasn't ready for, sat cool and still and entirely, permanently capable of running. Dana, the security contractor, kept a quiet and unobtrusive presence over the following days. A car in the driveway at night, a walking check of the perimeter twice during daylight hours. Cole noticed her without thinking about her, the way you notice something that is doing its job correctly. Sophie noticed her too, and asked about her once at dinner, and Cole told her the truth in the simplified version that 8-year-olds deserve, that someone was helping to make sure the car was safe while some important decisions were being made. Sophie thought about this and said, like a guard? Something like that. Okay, Sophie said, and went back to her pasta. That was the thing about Sophie. She processed, she asked what she needed to ask, and then she accepted the situation and got on with things. Cole had spent a lot of time in the past 8 years trying to figure out whether that quality was healthy resilience or something that worried him, and he hadn't fully resolved the question. Probably it was both. The days between the hearing and the auction were the strangest of the whole 14. The legal pressure had shifted, not gone, but changed shape. Sandra Chu had filed a motion that formally documented Webb's pattern of behavior, including the photograph from the archive, and the combined weight of it had apparently convinced Webb's attorney to advise against further emergency motions. But the anonymous call stayed with Cole. The specific nature of the threat, the garage, the car, the suggestion that Webb had contacts with access, made him work differently. He didn't leave the garage unlocked. He moved the documentation to a fireproof safe he borrowed from his neighbor Ted, who had one in his basement and hadn't opened it in 3 years. He made digital copies of everything and sent them to Sandra and to Victoria and to Mike Dorsey. He also kept working on the car. The cosmetic restoration was not going to be complete before the auction. There wasn't time, and he'd made peace with that. What he could do was get the car to a standard of mechanical integrity and presentation that would let serious collectors see what it was. He addressed the body panels that could be addressed in the time available: careful cleaning, the removal of surface oxidation from the chrome, a treatment of the leather interior that stopped the cracking from worsening without pretending to be a full restoration. He was methodical about it. He wasn't trying to make the car look new. He was trying to make it look honestly old. The difference between a thing that has been artificially polished to impress and a thing that has been cared for as a matter of respect. Victoria watched him work on the interior on the 13th afternoon, leaning against the garage door frame with her coffee. "You're not touching the patina on the dashboard," she said. "No. Most restorers would." "I know." Cole was working on the driver's seat with a leather conditioner, applying it slowly and in sections. "The patina is part of what it is. A 60-year-old car that looks 20 years old is lying about itself. This car shouldn't lie." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "The collectors who are going to be in that room will appreciate that," she said finally. "I'm not doing it for them." She looked at him. "I'm doing it because Lofthouse built something honest," Cole said. "He built it the way he thought it should be built, not the way he was told to. Seems like the least I can do is present it the same way." Victoria didn't say anything to that, but she stayed in the doorway for another hour, and when Cole finally looked up from the passenger seat, she was still there, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't the car and wasn't him, and was maybe just the thing those words had made her think about. The auction was set for a Saturday. Victoria had arranged it through a private auction house she worked with regularly. Not one of the major public names, but a specialized firm that handled significant automotive and collector transactions for clients who preferred discretion. The venue was a converted warehouse space outside Philadelphia that the firm used for private events, large enough for the car to be displayed properly, small enough that the guest list remained controlled. Cole drove the car there himself on the Friday afternoon before, which was the first time the Aston Martin had moved under its own power in 60 years, and the drive was complicated. The car was mechanical and imperfect in the way that anything old and purpose-built is imperfect. The steering was heavy. The brakes required commitment. The gearbox had a particular character in the shift between second and third that required learning rather than assumption. But the engine ran with a confidence that felt almost personal. Victoria followed in her own car. She'd offered to drive. He'd declined, and she hadn't pushed it. Dana followed in the security firm's vehicle. It was a 3-car procession through a gray Pennsylvania afternoon, and Cole drove the Aston Martin at 40 miles an hour the whole way, not because the car couldn't go faster, but because he wasn't going to rush something that had waited this long. When they pulled into the venue's loading bay, and Cole cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, he was aware of something releasing in his chest that had been held tight for 2 weeks. Not relief exactly. More like the specific feeling of a thing arriving at where it was supposed to be. He got out and looked at the car in the loading bay's industrial light. "You doing okay?" Victoria said from behind him. "Yeah." He thought about it. "Yeah, I am." She came to stand beside him, looking at the car. "You should know the confirmed bidders list looks strong. 7 serious collectors with documented interest in pre-production British iron. 2 more with broader collections who I think will participate once they see it run." She paused. "And 1 representative from a European automotive museum that has been trying to acquire a significant British prototype for 15 years. The museum won't necessarily be the highest bidder, but having institutional interest in the room changes the dynamic. Other buyers don't want to lose to a museum. It tends to accelerate the competitive response." Cole looked at her sideways. She said this with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who understood rooms like tomorrow's the way Cole understood engine blocks. Not arrogantly, just accurately. "Have you done this before?" he said. "Arranged a sale of this kind?" "Yes, several times." A pause. "Nothing quite at this intersection of circumstances." "Meaning?" She turned to look at him. "Meaning a first-time owner who found the car by accident, an authentication case built in 2 weeks, and a hostile prior owner applying ongoing pressure." She said it without drama. This is unusual. Are you worried? She thought about the question, which he appreciated. About the auction outcome? No. The provenance is solid and the car speaks for itself. Another pause, and then something shifted slightly in her expression. Less professional, more something else. About other things. Somewhat. Cole waited. She shook her head. Nothing that needs to be said right now. She looked at the car one more time and then at the men from the auction house who were waiting at a respectful distance to begin the setup process. Let's get it positioned. The morning of the auction, Cole woke up at 5 and couldn't get back to sleep. He lay in the dark and went through the mechanical state of the car, the systems, the work he'd done, the things that weren't perfect, and the things that were. He'd done this every morning since the car had arrived, but this morning it felt different because it was the last morning where the car was still entirely his problem, and by the end of the day, it would be somebody else's problem, which should have felt like a relief, and mostly did, but not entirely. He drove to Philadelphia to pick up Sophie at 8. He'd had her stay with Janet the previous night because the Friday transport and setup had run long, and Sophie had accepted this with minimal complaint because Janet had a dog and a television with more channels than Cole's. Sophie was waiting in Janet's driveway in her good clothes. Not her best clothes, but her good ones, the ones she wore for things that mattered. She'd done her own hair, which meant it was mostly correct with a section that had gone sideways near the back, which was the same as always. Cole opened the truck door for her, and she climbed in and looked at him. "Are you nervous?" she said. "A little." She nodded as though this was the correct answer. "That's okay," she said. "Being a little nervous means it matters." Cole looked at her. "Where did you get that?" She looked at the windshield. "I think I made it up." A pause. "Or maybe you said it. I don't remember." He drove. The venue filled slowly after 10, the way private events do. People arriving without the performative punctuality of public auctions, finding their way to the car with the unhurried interest of people who are accustomed to seeing significant things and have trained themselves not to appear impressed. Cole stood near the car for the first hour, answering questions from the auction house representatives and from two of the collectors who'd arrived early and wanted to look at the engine. He answered every question directly and completely. When he didn't know something, he said so. When he knew something with certainty, he said that too. One collector, a man in his 60s named Arthur Fenwick, who had the patient, careful manner of someone who has spent decades buying things that other people missed, asked Cole to start the engine. Cole started the engine. The sound in the enclosed space was different from the garage, more present. It filled the warehouse with the particular voice of something that had never been intended to be quiet, and the 7 collectors standing within earshot all stopped what they were doing and listened, and nobody spoke for the duration of the idle. Cole cut the engine after 2 minutes. Arthur Fenwick looked at him. "How confident are you in the authentication?" "Completely confident in the documentation provenance," Cole said. "Dr. Reyes's lab analysis is in the supplementary file. The engine specification matches the Project Meridian drawings in every measured dimension I was able to access. The wiring harness matches the schematic routing exactly." He paused. "I can't tell you there isn't something I missed. I'm a mechanic, not a historian. But I can tell you what I found and how I found it, and I can tell you the car is exactly what the documents say it is." Fenwick looked at the car for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. Not because of the documentation, because of the way Cole had answered, which was the same way the car answered, without pretense, without performance, with only what was actually there. Marcus Webb arrived at 11:45. Cole saw him from across the room, saw the door open and Webb come through it with Gerald Holt beside him, and the large, quiet man from the driveway 2 steps behind. The auction house's event manager intercepted them immediately, a polished professional exchange taking place near the entrance that Cole couldn't hear but could read clearly. Webb asserting some right to be present, the event manager explaining with polished firmness that the guest list was controlled. Victoria appeared at Cole's shoulder as if she'd been expecting this. "Sandra's already on the phone," she said. "Webb's attorney sent a last-minute filing this morning claiming a right to challenge the sale based on newly discovered evidence. Sandra says it has no basis. There's no new evidence. It's a delay tactic." "Can he stop the auction?" Not without a court order, which he doesn't have. Her voice was calm but had an edge under it. But he can create a scene, and a scene in this room could affect bitter confidence. Cole watched Webb talking to the event manager. Webb's expression had the particular controlled fury of a man who is losing something he believes is his and cannot quite accept the geometry of how that happened. "Let me talk to him," Cole said. "Cole, not to negotiate. I just want to look him in the eye." He moved toward the entrance before Victoria could respond. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Webb. The event manager looked between them, uncertain. Cole looked at the event manager and said, "Give us a minute." And the event manager, reading something in the way Cole said it, stepped aside. Webb looked at him with the flat, recalibrated expression from the courthouse, the face of someone who has run out of plays and knows it, but won't show it. "You don't have a right to be here," Cole said. He kept his voice level and quiet, not because he was managing himself, but because he was genuinely calm in a way that surprised him. "You sold a car to a man you thought wouldn't know what he had. You were wrong about that. The court agreed. The documentation is authenticated, and the car is legally mine." He paused. "Whatever you file today isn't going to change that outcome. It's going to create a record that your attorney is going to advise you, at some point, was a significant mistake." Webb said nothing. "I'm not angry at you," Cole said, which was mostly true. "You made a calculation. It didn't work out." He looked at the man directly. "But I need you to leave this room now because my daughter is here and I don't want her watching this." He held Webb's eyes. Webb looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Cole felt the weight of it, and then looked away. Something in his expression shifted, not to remorse exactly, but to something exhausted. He said something quiet to Holt. Holt's expression tightened, but he nodded. They left. Cole stood at the entrance for a moment, watching them go. Then he turned and walked back to the car, and Sophie was standing beside it with Victoria, and Sophie was looking at him with the particular Sophie expression that meant she had understood more of what just happened than she was going to say. "Is he gone?" she said. "Yeah, Bug. He's gone." She nodded. "Good," she said simply, and turned back to the car. The bidding opened at $2 million. Cole sat beside Sophie in two chairs set back from the main floor, positioned where they could see everything without being in the way of it. Victoria was on the floor, near the auction house representative, available for any questions about provenance. She'd offered to sit with Cole and Sophie, and Cole had told her to be where she needed to be, which she understood. Sophie had her hands in her lap and was watching with the intense, quiet focus she brought to things she considered important. Cole watched the room. The bidding moved in increments that stopped feeling like real numbers after the first few rounds. 2 million became 3, became 4.5, and the room thinned as bidders reached their limits and stepped back, leaving 4 serious contenders by the time it reached 6 million. Arthur Fenwick was still in it. The European Museum representative was still in it. 2 others Cole didn't know by name. At 7 million, one of the unknowns dropped out. At 8, the museum representative bid 8.5 and Fenwick countered at 9. And the museum representative was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Cole thought it was over, and then bid 9.2. Fenwick looked at the car from across the room. He'd been looking at it all afternoon with the expression of a man deciding how much he wanted something that he understood completely, and Cole recognized the look because it was related to how he'd looked at a broken engine on a dealership floor 3 weeks ago, knowing what he was seeing and knowing what it was going to cost. Fenwick raised his paddle. 9.8. The museum representative conferred quietly with someone on his phone. He bid 10. The room was very quiet. Fenwick lowered his paddle and shook his head slightly, a gesture so small that Cole almost missed it, and then looked at the car one last time with an expression that was disappointed and not quite, because he knew what he'd been in the presence of, even if he wasn't going home with it. The auctioneer let the silence extend to its proper length. 10 million, do I have 10,200,000? Nobody moved. Sold. Cole heard Sophie exhale beside him. He looked at her. She was looking at the car, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." $10 million. "Yeah." She turned and looked at him. and what was on her face was not excitement. Not yet. It was something quieter and more complicated, the face of a child who understands that the number matters less than what it means, and who has understood that from the beginning. "Is it enough?" she said. Cole thought about the debt, the mortgage, Sophie's college fund that didn't exist yet, the larger garage he'd been thinking about for 3 years, all the specific, unglamorous weight of what enough actually meant. "Yeah," he said. "It's enough." Sophie looked at her hands for a moment, then she leaned against his arm, the same way she'd leaned against him at the kitchen table on the night Victoria had first stayed late enough to have tea, and Cole put his arm around her and they sat in the warm noise of the room settling back into itself around them. Victoria crossed to them when the formal proceedings concluded. She looked, for the first time in all the days Cole had known her, not composed, not distressed, not emotional in any performance sense, but genuinely, visibly affected in a way that she hadn't managed to keep entirely internal. She stopped a few feet away, looking at both of them, and she seemed to be organizing what she wanted to say. "Congratulations," she said. And then, because that wasn't the whole of it, "You earned it." Cole looked at her. He thought about the morning she'd arrived at his garage with a laptop under her arm and coffee she hadn't offered to share. He thought about her sitting across the kitchen table at 11 at night going through archive photographs. He thought about the courtroom and the parking garage and the anonymous call in her response to all of it. Not flawless, not frictionless, but constant, present in the way that mattered. "We earned it," he said. Something moved across her face. She looked at Sophie, who was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment that Sophie brought to everything important. "Yeah," Victoria said quietly. "Maybe we did." Sophie, who had apparently decided this moment had lasted exactly long enough, stood up and said, "Can we get food? I'm hungry." And the weight of the afternoon broke open into something that was almost, mostly, against all practical expectation, the specific ordinary warmth of 3 people who have been through something together and come out the other side still standing, still themselves, still capable of being hungry at the end of a $10 million afternoon. Cole laughed. He hadn't laughed, actually laughed, in 2 weeks, and it came out rough and real and completely without dignity, and Sophie looked at him with the expression she reserved for when he did something that surprised her pleasantly. And Victoria looked at him with an expression that was entirely new, one he hadn't seen on her face before, and which he found that he very much wanted to see again. "Yeah," Cole said, getting to his feet. "Let's get food." They got burgers from a place 3 blocks from the venue that Sophie picked because it had a neon sign in the window shaped like a cow, and she considered this a strong indicator of quality. It was not a remarkable restaurant. The booths were vinyl and the menus were laminated, and the fries came in a red plastic basket lined with paper. Cole ate most of his without tasting it, not because it wasn't good, but because his mind was still somewhere in the warehouse with the sound of the auctioneer's gavel and the particular silence that had followed. Sophie ate with complete focus and satisfaction, the way she always ate when she was hungry, without self-consciousness, cleaning her basket and then looking at Cole's remaining fries with transparent interest. "You can have them," he said. She took them without ceremony. Victoria had ordered coffee and a side salad and was eating the salad with the slightly distracted quality of someone whose mind was also elsewhere, which Cole noticed without commenting on. The 3 of them sat in the vinyl booth in the late afternoon light coming through the front window, and the noise of the restaurant moved around them. Other tables, a television above the counter showing a sports recap, the sound of the kitchen, and it was so ordinary that it felt almost surreal against the backdrop of what the day had been. Sophie looked up from the fries. "What happens to the car now?" "The museum takes possession in 30 days, Victoria said, "after the payment clears and the transfer documentation is completed." "Will it be on display?" "That's their intention. The director told me they want to build an exhibit around the Project Meridian story. The letter, the schematics, Lofthouse's work. The car would be the centerpiece." Victoria looked at Sophie. "People will be able to see it." Sophie considered this. "That's good," she said. "It should be somewhere people can see it." Cole looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old, and she had just spent 3 weeks watching her father dismantle and rebuild a car worth $10 million in a small garage in Millhaven, Pennsylvania, and her considered opinion was that it should be somewhere people could see it. He felt a particular quality of love for her in that moment that had no name he knew of, the kind that came from recognizing that a person you are responsible for has turned out to be a better person than you had any right to take credit for. Yeah, he said, it is. The money arrived in Cole's account 11 days later, after the escrow cleared and the legal documentation was completed, and Sandra Chu had satisfied herself that every detail of the transfer was airtight. The number on the screen, after the auction house commission and Sandra's fees and the various costs that attach themselves to a transaction of that scale, was not $10 million. It was $8,342,000, which was a number so far outside anything Cole had ever associated with himself that looking at it on his phone in his kitchen at 7 in the morning felt briefly like looking at someone else's account. He made himself coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the number for a while. Then he called his accountant, a woman named Deborah, who had been doing his taxes for 6 years and who he had never once given interesting news, and told her what had happened and listened to the silence on the other end of the line that was Deborah taking a moment to recalibrate her professional relationship with reality. Okay, Deborah said finally. Okay, don't do anything with it until we talk. Don't move anything, don't pay anything, don't make any transfers. I know. Cole, I mean it. Don't buy anything. Deborah, I haven't bought anything unnecessary in 4 years. I'm not going to start now. She made an appointment for Thursday. Cole hung up and looked at the number one more time and then put his phone in his pocket and went to the garage. The garage was strange without the car. He'd known it would be and he hadn't been wrong, but the specific quality of the strangeness was harder to predict. It wasn't emptiness exactly. The tools were still there, the workbench, the shelving units along the back wall, the oil-stained concrete floor that no cleaning had ever fully addressed. It was more like the feeling of a room after someone has moved out of it, the presence of what had been there, made visible by its absence. He stood in the middle of the garage and looked at the space where the Aston Martin had sat for 3 weeks. He thought about Reginald Lofthouse, a man he'd never met and never could, who had built something extraordinary in secret and hidden it and written a letter that began this car was never meant to exist on paper and ended with the hope that whoever found it would understand what it was. Cole didn't know what Lofthouse had expected, whether he'd imagined the car found in a year or a decade or never. But he thought about the phrase until the world is ready to appreciate what she is. And he thought about 60 years of waiting. And he thought that whatever ready meant, it had apparently included a mechanic from a small Pennsylvania town with a broken-down car and a daughter who asked good questions. There was a kind of responsibility in that. Not a burden. He wasn't going to perform weight he didn't feel, but a responsibility. The car had been a message, and he'd received it, and the receiving had changed things in ways that went beyond the number on his phone screen. He owed it to himself to do something honest with that. Marcus Webb's situation resolved itself over the following 6 weeks, largely without Cole's involvement. The combination of Sandra Chu's documentation of Webb's legal harassment, the archive photograph establishing his family's prior knowledge of the vehicle, and the anonymous informant's disclosures, which Sandra had investigated carefully and partially corroborated through other sources, had created a picture of conduct that attracted attention beyond Cole's civil matter. A state licensing board opened an inquiry into Webb Automotive's sales practices. 2 former employees came forward with complaints about similar patterns involving other vehicles. A financial journalist who'd been looking into Webb's business operations for unrelated reasons published a piece that connected several threads. Cole didn't follow it closely. He heard about it in pieces, from Sandra, from Mike, once from Victoria, and he absorbed each piece without satisfaction and without particular regret. He didn't wish Marcus Webb harm in any specific sense. He just wished him less access to people he could take advantage of, which appeared to be what was happening. Webb Automotive closed its doors on a Tuesday in November. Cole heard about it from his neighbor Ted, who had seen it in the local business section of the Philadelphia paper, and who delivered the news with the particular relish of someone who had been following the drama from the beginning and felt personally vindicated by its resolution. Cole said, "Huh," and went back to what he'd been doing, which was installing a new lift in the expanded garage. The new garage was the first thing he'd built with the money, and it had taken longer than the financial decisions, and longer than anything else, because Cole had spent 3 weeks arguing with himself about whether it was the right kind of thing to spend money on. The argument went like this. He could do something larger. He could move. He could buy a property in a better location, establish a restoration business in a market with more affluent clients, position himself differently. Victoria had mentioned this carefully and once, and he'd listened carefully and once, and then told her that Millhaven was where Sophie was in school, and where his neighbor Janet had a dog Sophie loved, and where he knew which roads flooded in spring and which coffee place opened earliest on weekdays, and that those things mattered in ways that a better market position didn't fully compensate for. Victoria had nodded and not mentioned it again. The expanded garage was double the original footprint, built on the adjacent lot he'd bought from the retired couple next door who'd been meaning to sell for years. Proper vehicle lifts, 2 of them, commercial grade. A paint booth in the rear section, climate-controlled storage for parts and documentation. A small office space with a desk and a second chair, which he'd thought of as his own, but which Victoria had used approximately as often as he had in the months since it was finished. He hired one full-time mechanic, a 26-year-old named Ramon, who had been working at a dealership service center and was miserable there, and who had a gift for old European iron that was immediately obvious to anyone who watched him work. Ramon didn't say much and didn't need to. He and Cole developed a working rhythm inside 2 weeks that operated mostly through gesture and professional shorthand, the shared language of people who understand the same things. Sophie came to the garage after school sometimes, doing her homework on the corner of Cole's desk while the sounds of work moved through the space. She'd grown comfortable with it in the way kids grow comfortable with a parent's workplace when it's been present all their lives. Not actively interested in the details, but at ease in the environment, the smell of it, and the sounds of it as familiar as home. What? The thing with Victoria was not simple, and Cole would not have wanted it to be. She had her own life. Offices in Philadelphia and New York, a collection of significant vehicles maintained in a private facility outside Princeton, a professional network that operated at a level Cole had only glimpsed the edges of during the Aston Martin process. She traveled frequently. She had obligations and rhythms that had been established long before she'd driven to Millhaven with Mike Dorsey on a Tuesday morning and stood in a working-class garage and looked at a car that changed the weight of both their days. What developed between them was not immediate and not graceful, and not anything like the version of these things that gets described cleanly. It was the thing that actually happens when 2 people with established lives and real histories and specific damage find each other useful, and then find each other interesting, and then find themselves at a kitchen table at 10 at night, long after the professional reason to be there has concluded, talking about things that have nothing to do with provenance or legal strategy. She told him about her father once, a businessman who had been brilliant and relentless and had given her every material advantage and almost none of his time, and how she'd built her career partly as a conversation with that absence. She said it without self-pity and without drama and in a way that suggested she'd done her thinking about it already, but that talking about it still cost something. Cole told her about his wife. Her name had been Miriam. They'd met when Cole was 23 and she was 22, and they'd had 6 years together that were, on balance, good years, not unmarked by ordinary conflict and ordinary difficulty, but good in the foundational sense that mattered. She died of an aggressive cancer that had been diagnosed in February and had finished what it came to do by the following October, which was the same month Sophie turned 2. Victoria listened the way she listened to everything, actually without performance, and when he was done, she didn't say the things that people say, which he appreciated. "Sophie has her eyes," Cole said. It was not something he said often. Same color, the way they go direct when she's thinking about something. Sometimes I look at Sophie and it's like being handed something I didn't know I'd lost. Victoria looked at him for a moment. "Does that make it better or harder?" "Both," he said. "Depends on the day." She nodded. She seemed to understand that this was a complete answer. They were at the kitchen table when this conversation happened, which was where most of their real conversations happened. The kitchen table had become a kind of standing location for the 2 of them in the way that particular places become associated with particular relationships, without anyone choosing it deliberately. Sophie was asleep upstairs. The garage was dark and locked. The house had the quiet of a late weeknight in a small town, which is a specific kind of quiet, not silent but settled. Victoria was quiet for a moment after he'd spoken. Then she said, I want to be honest with you about something. Okay. I'm not very good at this. She said it without apology, but also without the performance of nonchalance. At whatever this is, being present with someone in the sustained way. She was looking at the table, not him. I've tried twice before, and both times I managed it for a while and then I got busy, or I made the work more important than the other thing, or I found a way to be somewhere else when being somewhere else was easier than dealing with what was in front of me. She looked up. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know it before you make any decisions about whatever we're doing. Cole looked at her. He thought about the 11 days she'd spent at his kitchen table during the most compressed and pressured period of his recent life. He thought about the photograph she'd found in the archive and not told him about until the courthouse, and the direct conversation afterward in the hallway, and the way she'd said I won't and meant it. He thought about the way she'd looked at Sophie making tea and the expression on her face in the restaurant after the auction. The one he'd wanted to see again, and had. Okay, he said. She looked at him, uncertain. That's it? I'm not very good at it either. He said it plainly. Since Miriam, I haven't really tried. I got good at not trying. It's easier to be competent at things than to be uncertain about people. He paused. I'm telling you that because you told me your thing. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite relieved. More like a person who has braced for a wall and found a door instead. So what do we do with that? She said. Cole thought about it. He was aware that this was the moment where the narrative version of a conversation like this would provide a clean answer. The speech that resolved the tension. The declaration that settled things. Real life didn't work that way, and he wasn't going to offer her a version of himself that was more resolved than he actually was. I think we keep doing what we're doing, he said. Honestly. And we tell each other when it's not working instead of getting busy or finding somewhere else to be. She looked at him for a long moment. That sounds harder than it sounds, she said. Yeah, Cole said. Probably it is. She picked up her coffee cup, which was empty, and looked into it and set it back down. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of uncomplicated happiness. It was two imperfect people in a kitchen in a small Pennsylvania town agreeing to be honest with each other, which is not romantic in the cinematic sense, but is, in the practical sense, the hardest and most necessary thing that two people can agree to. Sophie found out about the two of them the way she found out about most things. She noticed. She didn't say anything directly. She was 8, and then she was 9, and she watched the way adults are watched by children who have learned that watching carefully tells you more than asking. She watched the way Victoria was at the kitchen table more often than she needed to be for professional reasons. She watched the way Cole's posture changed slightly when Victoria's car pulled into the driveway. She watched the way Victoria listened when Sophie talked, which was the specific quality of listening that Sophie had learned to distinguish from the performative version. She said something about it once, on a Saturday morning in March when she was 9, and Cole was making pancakes and Victoria was at the table with coffee, reading something on her phone. Sophie came downstairs in her pajamas and looked at the scene with her inventory expression, and then said, without particular effect, "Are you guys together?" Cole put down the spatula. Victoria looked up from her phone. Sophie looked between them with complete equanimity, as if she'd asked whether they wanted maple syrup. "We're figuring it out," Cole said, which was the truth. Sophie considered this. "Okay," she said. Then, "Are you making chocolate chip pancakes? I was going to make regular. Can you make chocolate chip?" "Yeah, Bug. I can make chocolate chip." She climbed into her chair. "Victoria, do you want chocolate chip too?" Victoria looked at Sophie for a moment with the expression Cole now recognized as Victoria being genuinely moved by something and managing it imperfectly. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Sophie picked up her fork and waited, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had decided the situation was acceptable and could now focus on breakfast. That was all she said about it. She didn't revisit it, didn't interrogate it, didn't perform acceptance in any way that felt like performance. She simply adjusted, the way children adjust to things when the adults around them are honest about what's happening and stable about the things that matter, and moved on. Cole thought about that for days afterward, about what it meant that his daughter's primary response to learning that her father was trying to build something with someone was to ask about pancakes. He thought it meant that Sophie felt secure enough in what they already had. The two of them, their small house, the garage, the specific geography of their life together, that she had room to let something new enter it without feeling threatened by the addition. He had done something right somewhere to get to that. He wasn't sure exactly what, and he wasn't going to claim more credit than he deserved, but some of it was real, and he let himself feel that. The exhibit at the museum opened on a Friday in April, 8 months after the auction. The museum had done it carefully. Cole had been consulted at several points during the design process, which surprised him and which Victoria said was unusual and spoke to how seriously they were treating the car's origin story. The exhibit was built around Project Meridian as a whole, the engineering context of the early 1960s, Lofthouse's biography reconstructed from archive materials, the correspondence with David Ashworth, and the decades of the car's disappearance presented as a mystery that the exhibit resolved rather than left open. The Aston Martin sat at the center of it, behind glass but visible from all sides, lit in a way that showed the original paint without flattering it, the honest dark green of it, the patina on the chrome, the repaired but not disguised evidence of its long neglect. The leather interior, conditioned but not replaced, the dashboard, untouched. An audio element in the exhibit played a recording of the engine running, which Cole had made in his garage on the 14th day. 12 seconds of idle, then cut. The museum director had said it was the detail that made the exhibit real. The fact that you could hear the thing, that it wasn't a static artifact but a mechanical fact proven and documented and alive. Cole stood in front of the car on the opening night with Sophie on one side and Victoria on the other. Sophie was wearing a dress, a rare occurrence, because the opening was the kind of event that warranted a dress, which Sophie had determined independently and which Cole had not argued with. She was looking at the car with an expression that was different from any expression she'd brought to it before. Not the curious assessment from the garage in the early days, not the watchful concern of the weeks with Webb, not the post-auction release in the restaurant. This was something quieter, the expression of seeing something arrive at where it belongs. "It looks right here," she said. "Yeah," Cole said. "It does." A man near them, one of the other opening night guests, was reading the exhibit text beside the car, and Cole watched him reach the section about the letter and stop, reading more slowly. The man was in his 50s, silver-haired, the kind of person who attended museum openings because he genuinely cared about the things in them. He read to the end of the panel and then looked at the car for a long moment and then looked around, as if he wanted to say something to someone. His eyes landed on Cole. Something in Cole's posture or proximity to the exhibit must have communicated connection, because the man said, "Did you know the person who found it?" Cole looked at him. "That's me," he said. The man looked at him. A mechanic in his best clothes at a museum opening, standing beside a 9-year-old in a dress, and a woman who was looking at the car with the particular expression of someone who had been there for all of it. The man looked at all three of them, and his expression was not disbelief, but something like wonder at the specific improbability of it. "How did you know?" the man said. "When you first saw it, how did you know it was something?" Cole thought about the question. He thought about the dealership floor and Marcus Webb's practiced contempt and the way the car had sat in the back corner like an apology. He thought about the wiring harness and the engine block tolerances and the leather folder wrapped in oilcloth behind the dashboard. He thought about sitting on the garage floor at midnight with a flashlight and the feeling of a question beginning to take shape. "I didn't know," Cole said. "I thought it might be something. There's a difference." He paused. "If I'd needed to know before I looked, I wouldn't have looked." The man nodded slowly, as if this answered something beyond the specific question. He thanked Cole and moved on, back to the exhibit text, back to the car. Victoria was looking at Cole. "That's the whole story, isn't it?" she said. Not quite a question. "What do you mean?" "What you just said." She was still looking at him, and the expression she had was the one from the restaurant, the new one, The one he'd wanted to see again and had been seeing regularly for months now, but which still did the same thing to him every time. You didn't need certainty. You just needed enough reason to keep going. Cole thought about that. He thought about whether it was true only about the car or about other things too. About a woman who'd shown up with a laptop and didn't share her coffee, about the specific calculated risk of telling her she could stay, about all the things he'd tried since Miriam that hadn't worked because he'd needed to know the outcome before he committed to the attempt. Maybe, he said. She turned back to the car. Sophie was pressed against the glass barrier, looking at the interior, the steering wheel, the gauges, the cracked leather she'd watched her father treat with careful hands on a Thursday afternoon in March. The 12 seconds of engine sound played from the audio element nearby, and Sophie went still when it started, listening, and Cole watched her listen to it and thought about Reginald Lofthouse sitting in a factory in 1963 with this same engine running, probably the only person in the room, writing in the margins of technical drawings about a world that wasn't ready yet. He'd been right that the world wasn't ready then. He hadn't known how long it would take, and he hadn't known what form ready would take when it came. He'd built the best thing he could build and hidden it and hoped, which was all any person could do with something they'd made that the present moment couldn't hold. The 12 seconds ended. The garage fell quiet, and then the museum moved around them again. Other voices, other footsteps. The ordinary business of a room full of people looking at extraordinary things. Sophie turned around from the glass barrier. She looked at Cole and then at Victoria and then at both of them together with the particular Sophie assessment, direct and uncomplicated. "Can we get food after this?" she said. Victoria laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind she didn't produce often, and which Cole had come to treat as something worth noting when it happened. Cole felt the warmth of it, standing between the two of them, in the blue-lit hush of the exhibit with the car behind the glass, and the whole improbable chain of events that had led here assembled somewhere in the middle distance, visible if you cared to look. "Yeah, Bug," he said, "we can get food." Sophie turned back to the exhibit, satisfied, and went to read the panel about Reginald Lofthouse. Cole watched her read, tracing the words with her finger the way she did when the text was dense, stopping at words she didn't know, and working out their meaning from context, which was something she'd been doing since she was 6, and which she was good at. Victoria slipped her hand into his. It was a quiet thing. No announcement, no ceremony. Her hand in his, in a museum, beside an exhibit they'd built together out of a broken car and a leather folder and 2 weeks of obstinate work. He closed his hand around hers. There is a version of this story that ends with a revelation. The moment the protagonist understands everything, sees clearly, arrives at the resolution the narrative has been building toward. Cole had expected to feel something like that. He'd expected the museum opening, or the auction, or the day the engine fired to be the moment where it all crystallized into meaning. It didn't work that way. It kept being ordinary moments that accumulated meaning slowly, the way sediment builds into something solid. Sophie at the kitchen table with homework, the sound of Ramon working in the garage in the early morning, Victoria's coffee cup that was always on the right side of the workbench now, the engine recording playing in a museum 8 months after he'd made it on a phone propped against a toolbox in Millhaven. What he understood, standing there, was something simpler than a revelation. It was just this, that value is not always obvious, and the things most worth finding rarely announce themselves. That a car left to rot in the back corner of a dealership and a life going carefully and quietly in a small town can both be waiting for the same thing. Someone who looks when they could have walked past, who asks when they could have assumed, who stays with something uncertain long enough to find out what it actually is. Cole had not been looking for a $10 million prototype. He'd been looking for a car that would hold together long enough to get his daughter to a school performance. What he'd found instead was everything else: the car, the letter, the woman beside him, and the particular lesson that the things you find when you're not looking for them are often the things that matter most. He was not a man given to speeches or declarations, and there was no one in particular he needed to say this to. Sophie already lived it. Victoria understood it in her own language. He was aware that this didn't make him unusual or instructive. It made him someone who got lucky, and who also made a choice to look when another person might have walked past. and who would not have known the difference if he hadn't been the kind of person who thought a broken car was worth 4 hours of his time on a Tuesday morning. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Sophie finished reading the Lofthouse panel and came back to them. She looked at their joined hands with the expression of someone confirming something they already knew, and she didn't say anything about it, and instead she tucked herself under Cole's free arm and looked at the car through the glass one last time. "He would have been glad," she said. "The man who built it, that people can see it now." Cole looked at the car, the dark green paint under the careful museum light. The engine that had waited 60 years to run and had run, had answered, had said what it was built to say to anyone willing to listen. "Yeah," he said. "I think he would." The three of them stood there for a moment longer, his daughter, the woman beside him, and the car behind the glass. And then Sophie said they should look at the other rooms because there was a section about early racing history that her teacher had told her about. And they went to look at the other rooms, and the exhibit stayed as it was, and the car stayed where it was. And outside the museum, the April evening was cool in particular and full of the ordinary, irreplaceable business of the world going on.